Throughout the month of May, CHSA has been hosting programs and dedicating its activities to supporting Chinese American voices and also condemning anti-Asian American hate. And that is why we're honored to have Frank speak to our guest today about civil rights for our Chinese American community. Frank has had an incredible career. He is currently the president of Queens College in New York City. Prior to Queens, he served as a chancellor and dean of UC Hastings in San Francisco. He's also a faculty member, was a faculty member at Howard University and served as the dean of Wayne State University Law School. In his leadership roles at Queens College, UC Hastings, and Wayne, as well as a faculty member at Howard, he was the first Asian American to serve in this capacity. He's also authored several books, including Yellow, Race in America Beyond Black and White, and contributed to CHSA's History and Perspectives Journal. And I'm going to tell you that this is only a brief summary of his accomplishments and contributions to law, education, and civil rights discourse. So join me in honoring and welcoming Frank H. Wu. Thank you very much for joining us today. Okay. And Frank, I think you're on mute, so we're going to turn you off.
All right. Can you hear me now? Hello, hello. After a year of the pandemic, you would think I would have learned. Are you able to hear me?
Yes.
Okay, terrific. All right. Let's put the PowerPoint up and we'll leave ample time for Q&A because dialogue is at the heart of our diverse democracy. So here we go. Let's go to the first slide, please. So I wrote a book called Yellow, Race in America Beyond Black and White. It came out more than 20 years ago, and I want to explain why I wrote this book. It started in college. I wanted to write a term paper about Asian Americans and civil rights. So I went to the library and I looked up Asian Americans and civil rights in the card catalog. That's how you know I'm not young. Before the internet, before Google, some of you remember, you used to, when you went to a library, go to the card catalog room where there were all these funny cabinets, like the size of dressers. And they had these drawers you'd pull out, and every book was indexed on 3x5 cards by author, by title, and by subject. So I looked up Asian Americans and civil rights, and there were no books. And it wasn't because it was a bad library. There were no books because no one had ever thought to put those concepts into the same book title at all. That book just didn't exist. So then I thought, well, maybe I'll look up Asian Americans. So I did, and there were 2 books. So I read those 2 books, and I could claim to be an expert. That's not about me. That's about the lack of books. It's not often that you can go and find a subject and read every single academic book ever written about it, but that was still possible to do with Asian Americans. Ronald Takaki's History of Asian Americans didn't come out until some years thereafter. So I thought, well, let me read books about race. So I went and found books about race. It didn't matter whether they were by liberals or conservatives, whether they were old or new, whether they were by historians or sociologists, whether they were thick or thin, whether they were theoretical or filled with data. They all used a black and white paradigm. Now let's go to the first slide, please. That's a way of looking at the world. I'll give you a couple of examples. So in 1967, some of you might remember that year. It was the year of the long, hot summer. It's the year I was born. I'll be 54 this year. So 1967 is within my lifetime, just barely. It was a time when in city after city after city across the nation, coast to coast, there was unrest, and it was called either riots or rebellions, depending on your perspective. Armored personnel carriers rolled down the streets, and troops were called in places such as Detroit, the Motor City, my hometown. And so this was understandably very concerning to people of every background, and the federal government set up a commission to look into it. It was called the Kerner Commission. It's named for a fellow named Otto Kerner. He was the governor of the state of Illinois. Next year, they published a book, and it purported to explain what was going on. And it was stark. For government reports, you wouldn't find such a dramatic depiction of the state of the nation. And it said America was not a nation, it was 2 nations. A generation later, a fellow named Andrew Hacker, a scholar, he's actually a professor at Queens College, where I am. He's in his 90s and still going strong. He wrote a bestseller called Two Nations, Black and White, Separate, Hostile, and Unequal. Now, it's a fine book. It has all the data and it's a thoughtful description, except like the Kerner report, it uses a black and white paradigm. Everyone fits into just one of two boxes, and there are only two boxes. You're either black or you're white, or you don't exist. Now, when I was in college, I wanted to write a good term paper. And so I thought, there's something wrong here. And it wasn't out of ethnic pride. It wasn't because I was Asian American that I was offended is the wrong word. I was disturbed. I thought, these books, they're all just wrong. All I had to do was stroll across campus or walk down the street, and I could see that there were people who were Latino, there were people who were Native American, there were people of mixed background, not to mention Asian Americans. So I set out to do something different, and that was to include Asian Americans and to do so in the spirit of bridge building, coalition, to help advance the historic struggle for Black equality, to unite, not to divide. Next slide, please. So as I did this work, I came across W.E.B. Du Bois. Now, you know, when you're in college, you have that conceit that all young people have. Every idea you come up with is original. It's yours. It's unique. You're the first person to have thought of it. Well, you know, if you write about or talk about race in America, you will read W.E.B. Du Bois. He had his theory of the talented tenth, that the African Americans who'd achieved a modicum of success had not only rights and should advocate for equality, but had responsibilities to lift up those after. He talked about what does it mean to be a problem, to be discussed as the Negro problem, as was done at the time, discussed by whites as if you were a subject. He spoke of dual consciousness. Now, Du Bois was a race man. What I mean by that is he was dedicated to the uplift of African Americans. He was a public intellectual before that term had even been coined. And he was a founder of the NAACP. He was an activist of the First Order, an intellect of the First Order, really someone well worth studying today. And in 1903, he wrote a magisterial collection of essays. It's never gone out of print. It's called The Souls of Black Folk. I commend it to you. I have, I think, 2 copies on the bookshelf behind me. There's a quote. And when students turn in a paper to me about race and they quote Du Bois, when I see this quote, I usually can guess that they haven't read the actual essay that they've drawn the quote from, because the words that I've reproduced here, at the top in the larger print, that's how this quote is always given. The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. Now, Du Bois, writing in 1903, was prescient. He predicted, and he was profound in analyzing the situation, the issues that face the body politic. What's interesting, though, is that's not even half the words in the sentence. What Du Bois actually wrote, and you can see the rest of the sentence in the smaller print at the bottom, is the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line, dash, the relation of the darker to the lighter races men in Asia and Africa and in the Americas and the islands of the sea. Those additional words aren't just surplus that he added, they're meaningful. And what this shows is that someone who's dedicated to the struggle for Black equality situated that struggle within a global context. So the project that I proposed, Race Beyond Black and White, isn't my project at all. It's Du Bois's project. All right, next slide. And it turns out that Asian Americans are significant. This slide is actually already out of date. I've left it in to emphasize the huge growth. Asian Americans are the fastest growing of all racial groups in the United States. They're now at about 23 million, if you can believe that. And it's a majority foreign born. The 6th largest groups in terms of the numbers are shown in the pie chart over on the right. So you can take a look. Those 6 groups constitute about 85% of the population that's characterized as Asian American. And it's not just that Asian Americans are fast growing. Asian Americans have always been around, and in particular, Chinese Americans. Next slide, please. I show here a few images of allyship. In the center is a picture of Malcolm X as he lies dying. He's been shot, assassinated. It's the Audubon Ballroom of New York City in 1965, and tending to him is one of his closest confidants and colleagues, someone who's always by his side, Yuri Kochiyama, someone who's Japanese American. There she is a few years later giving a Black Power salute. So with one of the most prominent African American leaders, always there with him was someone who was Asian American. In the lower right is the delegation sent by the Japanese American Citizens League to march with the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. in 1963 in Washington, D.C. After internal debate, they decided it was important for them to be there. And so, as you did when you protested back then, they dressed in their Sunday best, brought out their banner, and they were there under the hot sun. On the left is someone Chinese American, Grace Lee Boggs, with her spouse, James Boggs, an African American who was the son of sharecroppers. They were labor organizers in Detroit. So these are just a few of the many examples of the Asian Americans, including Chinese Americans, who marched, protested, and labored alongside African Americans in the struggle for civil rights. A part of history that was always there, but has been neglected and forgotten, even by Asian Americans or Chinese Americans ourselves. Next slide, please. This is just to show how the allyship was reciprocal. This is Martin Luther King marching in Selma, one of the most famous civil rights events. And take a look at this photo. It's hidden in plain sight. Almost all of the folks at the front are wearing leis sent from Hawaii. Now, Hawaii was a new state at the time. It had entered the Union in 1959. And someone Asian, including of Chinese descent, but with many different Asian ethnicities, had sent these. That's what Hawaii was like. And that's why he sent them, because Hawaii was a place that had the sort of mixing and I don't want to suggest it's an ideal paradise. I know that it's not, but relative to the South, it set an example of different minority groups and whites as well coming together. So this was sent in solidarity. The pastor in Hawaii wanted Dr. King to have leis. Now, remember, this is before easy jet travel. It's before overnight delivery. This was a difficult task to get fresh leis all the way from Hawaii to the U.S. mainland, to the deep South, so that Dr. King could wear them. I don't actually know the inside story of how they got there. I've researched this, but I don't know how they got there. But I do know Federal Express wouldn't be invented for another generation. So this was no small task. And Dr. King wore them out of solidarity because he thought that there was a common cause here. Next slide, please. Let's turn now to the historic presence of Asian Americans, and in particular, Chinese Americans. You know, and most people do, because it's the one sentence that's in the history books, that Chinese Americans, that Chinese immigrant men, built the Transcontinental Railroad, the western half. They constituted more than 90% of the workforce. And there's a painting here. CHSA actually owns the series of these paintings by Jake Lee. This shows the Chinese workers being lowered in wicker baskets to blast their way through sheer granite rock face. This is where that phrase, some of you may know, it's considered a derogatory phrase, a Chinaman's chance. It's where that phrase comes from. Why? Because, well, the workers, they're using dynamite, which was a new technology at the time. The explosive was highly volatile, and it could go off, and they would lose life and limb if it went off before they could be hoisted back up in their wicker basket. So 10 to 15,000 laborers contributed to this massive infrastructure project. Now, bear in mind, the United States wasn't one at the time. It had just fought a civil war. And if you wanted to travel from Boston to San Francisco, you had a perilous overland journey of weeks, or voyage on the open waters, also of weeks. So the Transcontinental Railroad was a speculative infrastructure project, the most massive of its time. It's what realized that concept of manifest destiny, the notion that Christians of European background would have dominion over the North American continent. So the irony is that was made possible by Asian, specifically Chinese laborers. Now, some of you know this story because you're active with CHSA, but look at the photo in the center, the black and white photo. That photo would have been one of the most recognized photos of its era because it's part of a series that's iconic. That's the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. It was a huge moment in American history, and people knew that. They were self-conscious. This is what is going to bring America together. It was the driving of the Golden Spike, and there was a ceremony at Promontory Point, Utah, in 1869. Now, this photo, it's not that big, but it doesn't matter how big you blow it up. It doesn't matter if you take out a magnifying glass. What you won't see is any Asian face. The Chinese men who were responsible for the western half of the railroad weren't invited to the party. They're absent from the festivities. So that's literal and symbolic of how the Chinese were treated at the time. In an act of photographic justice, Corky Lee, who passed away, the late Corky Lee, he died of COVID during the peak of the pandemic that we've just made it through. Every year, he would trek out to the isolated high desert of Promontory Point, Utah, with the descendants of those Chinese railroad workers. So now we're talking 6th and 7th generation, and they would reenact the ceremony. Some of you may know that at the centennial in 1969, because the actor John Wayne was to speak, the Chinese American representative associated with CHSA was bumped from the program. So even 100 years afterward, the same mistake of not acknowledging Chinese was repeated, though at the 150th, the sesquicentennial, there was ample Chinese American presence. Next slide, please. You know, I study Asian Americans, and even I was shocked to learn this. Take a look at the book published by the National Park Service. I stumbled across this when I was out on Angel Island. It's a terrific book. I think CHSA has it in the gift shop, and I would commend it to you. This book shows that not one, not two, not dozens, but hundreds of Asian immigrant and Pacific Islander immigrant soldiers served in the United States Civil War. That's 1861 to 1865. They fought in Union and Confederate armies. Their names appear on the rosters. There are even photos, as this one on the cover of the book, which was of someone who was of Chinese descent and who was adopted. So it wasn't just the Transcontinental Railroad. Asian Americans, and at that time, of course, they wouldn't have been called Asian Americans. I'll touch upon that in a moment. And they would have been primarily of Chinese descent, though not exclusively, were present for far longer than most of us realize, even those of us who are Asian Americans ourselves. Yet after that, they were driven out. Some of you may know in places such as Rock Springs, Wyoming. That's the black and white photo on the right. There were massive riots in which Chinese were driven out and killed. There was arson, there was shooting, stabbing, and lynching. In 1871, for example, in downtown Los Angeles, when it was still a frontier town, 1 out of 10 of the individuals of Chinese descent was killed in a 24-hour time period. I show here one of 2 books that discusses that time before the Chinese Exclusion Act. Now, some people are tempted to say, well, this was citizens versus aliens, but that's not the case. Many of the attackers were themselves immigrants. Many of the people who agitated for the Chinese exclusion had come to these shores as well. They were immigrants from Europe, such as Dennis Kearney, the Sandlot orator in San Francisco, who was from County Cork, Ireland. Next slide, please. Let's turn now to the contemporary image of Asian Americans. And there are 2 that I'd like to spend some time talking about. The first of them is the model minority myth. Even if you've never heard that term, you know the concept. It's the whiz kid, rocket scientist, child genius. You can do calculus in your head. You went to college at the age of 11, perfect grades and test scores. Image of Asian immigrants and their American-born children. It's the why are all the spelling bees, science fairs, and math contests being won by people named Nguyen and Patel and Kim? That image was introduced in the 1960s. There was an article about Japanese Americans and an article about Chinese Americans that came out in the 1960s with a modern version of this myth. People are very helpfully adding things in the chat for me. Thanks so much. If you're looking for the Chinese American version, it was published in U.S. News and World Report in 1963 or 1964. I don't know if that one is available online. I know the Japanese American one, published in the New York Times, you can find. It was in the Sunday magazine. Now, I want to be clear. Next slide, please. People sometimes say to me, what's wrong with you? Why can't you just accept a compliment? People are trying to say something nice about you. You're hardworking. You're good at math and science. What are you, politically correct, thin-skinned? And, don't you appreciate that Asian immigrants have done well? Let me be clear. I applaud Asian immigrants who have done well. I respect them. That's wonderful. We should all admire them. My concern is when it's a racial generalization that all or almost all Asian Americans are doing well. And I'd like to explain why we might be troubled by this. Next slide, please. Let's start with the facts. So it turns out that if you look at Asian Americans, and even if you look at specific ethnic groups such as Chinese Americans, you find that migration is selective, that it's brain drain, and that it's distributed, especially now, in what the folks who are good at statistics call a bimodal curve. Now, that's a fancy term. You might be thinking to yourself, what is a bimodal curve? Well, take a look at the image on the left. That's a bimodal curve. It's a camel with two humps, not a camel with one hump. All right, what does this mean? All right, one of those peaks are high net worth individuals. They're the folks who come with $10 million cash and plunk it down and buy a condominium in Manhattan or in San Francisco for their children. It's people who are ultra high net worth. They have financial capital, or they have human capital. They already have a PhD or MD, and they're able to get a green card and increase their wages by coming here. Or they're coming on scholarships in order to get a PhD or MD, so they're not representative. What I mean by that is studies consistently show that they aren't the same, on average, as the cousins they leave behind. Some studies even suggest that in the past, the migrants tended to be healthier. That makes sense, right? Because it was a perilous voyage. And if you had to make your way from the provinces to the sea coast to the big city, well, that's one migration. Then you have to travel all the way to a new land. So the people who migrated, whether it's you, your parents, your grandparents, or 5 generations ago, in general, are healthier than their own family members whom they leave behind, and often display more drive. So what's up with this bimodal curve? Well, Asian Americans, and you see this even within ethnic groups, Asian Americans as a whole have the greatest level of income stratification, including compared to other groups such as Blacks. That means there is a huge gap. There are those who make a lot of money and those who don't. And when you think about it, what's the other peak of the curve? Well, those are the undocumented, right? The migrants coming on the Golden Venture, which ran aground spectacularly a generation ago, carrying human cargo. The snakehead operation smuggling in Chinese. It's the people who are the ride-hail service drivers. It's the wait staff at the all-you-can-eat buffet, right? So alongside the well-to-do migration, there's a less well-to-do migration. So the model minority myth is just inaccurate as a factual matter. And never mind the politics of it. It's just not true that all or almost all Asian Americans are doing well and upper middle class and so on. It's true of some. There's no doubt about that. But like all other generalizations based on race, if we assume it's true of all, well, it leads to some unintended consequences, possibly some negative ones. And that's what I'm going to show you now. Next slide, please. So the first problem is whitewashing of bias. The problem that when Asians complain, it's, oh, come on, what's the big deal? We all know you're rich. You got no problems. You're doing better here than you would be in your homeland. It's just denial until recently of, for example, the hate crimes. People would say, oh, come on, that's random. That's not racial. How do you know that's racial? And, what's the big deal? You don't have it as bad as others. Well, if you look at the study by Buck G, who's active with CHSA, he published it in the Harvard Business Review. It's statistical. What they did was they looked at Silicon Valley. All right, so even in a place in an industry where Asian Americans are overrepresented, what do you find? Well, this is what the headline tells you. And it includes other racial minority groups. Asian Americans are the least likely group to be promoted to management. I think about the role that I have, or all of the leadership roles that I've had, and this isn't a testament to my skill. It is instead a reflection of how few Asian Americans there are, even though they are qualified. So people have said, well, how do we know there are enough Asian Americans? Well, easy, because if you look at the entry level, at law firms, accounting firms, et cetera, Asian Americans are quite overrepresented, and there sure are a lot of them statistically. But then the higher up you go, the fewer there are, in a way that's an anomaly. It's not what you would predict based on the enormous numbers and proportions earlier in the pipeline. So it's not that they're not there. Some people have said, well, maybe Asian Americans aren't interested in these leadership roles. That's also not true. People have studied it, and Asian Americans would like to be in charge just like anyone else. Next slide, please. What's worse is the mono-minority myth ratchets up racial resentment. As Ronald Takaki has said, Asian immigrants have been punished for their virtues rather than their vices. Let me give you a few examples of this. So look at the pamphlet called Meat versus Rice. This was published 125 years ago. It went through multiple editions. This is the 1902 or 1903 version from the Asiatic Exclusion League. It's written by Samuel Gompers, a progressive labor leader. Meat versus Rice is really, it's absurd, it's laughable. It does not argue that Chinese immigrants are inferior workers. It argues they're superior. Sound familiar? That's the mono-minority myth. It says they work harder. Not that they're shiftless and indolent, but that they work so hard they constitute unfair competition. And part of the argument is Asians, according to Gompers, eat rice. So they subsist on something that's cheap. Whites have to eat meat. So Gompers says, well, this is no fair because the Asians just eat rice and then they outperform the whites. And with the coolie labor system of organization, instead of suggesting that Asian immigrants not be exploited, he said, well, let's exclude them because they're outperforming and the white working man just can't compete in the marketplace against Asians. So it's not an argument that Asian Americans don't do well. It's an argument that they do too well. It's the model minority myth. Think about the musician, the child prodigy of Asian background who can play the violin at the age of 3, the piano at the age of 5, maybe who's playing both instruments simultaneously at Carnegie Hall by the time they're 7. And they don't miss a note. What do people say? Oh, technically perfect, but no character, no soul. So the very perfection is held against Asian Americans. So this is why the image should be troubling to Asian Americans, though I know that some would like to embrace it because it's flattering. Well, let's turn to the next slide. So the third point is it's false flattery. Often it's not about Asian Americans at all. It's just a way of saying to African Americans and other people of color, oh, look at the Asians, they made it, why can't you? Using a false comparison. So it pits Asian Americans against other immigrants and against other people of color as the good immigrants, as the model minority. That's the point of the very term, right? If you're a model minority, for whom are you a model? What does it mean to be an overachiever? You know, when I was a kid growing up, my parents used to compare me to the kids of their friends. They would say, oh, why can't you be more like, Johnny? He got a perfect SAT score. It always made me want to go punch that kid in the nose, which is a normal human reaction, right? And when it's racialized, it creates this racial competition, this racial envy, this racial hierarchy, and it exacerbates already existing tensions. So it doesn't really help Asian Americans in the complex dynamics of racial politics in America. Next slide, please. The other predominant image is the perpetual foreigner syndrome. It's exemplified by the question, where are you really from? Now, look, there's nothing wrong with asking anyone, where are you from? Everyone says, where are you from, right? You go to a new job, you go to college, you go to a cocktail party, you meet friends of friends. Oh, where are you from? Right? It's an icebreaker. It's how you start a conversation to get a sense of where someone is literally and figuratively coming from, right? The problem is that when I say Detroit, people furrow their brows. They say, no, 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 that's not what I mean. And this is a question we only ask selectively. I know because I've asked white folks, where are you really from? And they get flustered. Well, I'm from Iowa. I'm an American. I just told you so. Well, exactly. They're assured of their identity even as they challenge mine. Now, look, there's nothing wrong with saying I'm from China. That's what my parents would say. They are from China. The problem here is that it's selective and it disbelieves the speaker, right? It says, well, no, you can't actually be from Detroit. You're probably a spy, you're a saboteur, you're a sleeper agent, you're a sojourner. That was the term used then. Someone only temporarily here. You're a tourist who forgot your camera back at the hotel room. And it's the consequences that follow. Where are you really from is often a prelude to, as so many of us have experienced, something far more negative and not innocent, not just a question of where are you from. Next slide, please. This actually leads to policies. The internment of Japanese Americans is the most obvious example. I'm going to use an offensive term, and I'm going to use it very deliberately because I want to show it has no power over me, and because that's the word that was used then, and it packs a punch, and it should. Lieutenant General John L. DeWitt, commander of the Western Defense, based in San Francisco during World War II, said simply, a Jap's a Jap, and that's all there is to it. He and others argued assimilation was a trick, that racial affinities were not severed by migration, and that even if you were second or third generation, men, women, children, the elderly, the disabled alike, that you would be disloyal and you had to be locked up. So losing liberty, equality, dignity, jobs, homes, possessions, family pets, being allowed only what you could carry, which was 2 suitcases, 120,000 people, 2/3 of them United States citizens, were sent to the internment camps for the duration of the war. Even if you were a military veteran, take a look at the sepia tone photo of someone who had served the United States in the Great War. That's what World War I was called before World War II. He's put on his uniform years later as he's taken away probably by people who he would have outranked because he's of Japanese descent. The photo of the kids waving the flag, pledging allegiance to the Stars and Stripes, was taken by Dorothea Lange, one of the most famous photographers. She did the migrant mother photo, you probably know. It's the photo that represents the Great Depression. Well, Dorothea Lange was commissioned by the United States government to take photos of the internment camps. So sympathetic was she to her subjects that the US government seized the prints and the negatives, impounded them, and stored them away in the National Archives for more than a half century so people could not see them because she showed the Japanese Americans as just ordinary people. Like many of the Chinese, many of them had converted to Christianity all throughout San Francisco, and probably some of you belong to these congregations. There are Asian immigrant churches that go back some 5 generations, some of them well over a century, that have a predominantly Asian American congregation, and that may be Baptist or Presbyterian. These were baseball playing, flag waving, apple pie loving Americans. But because it was Japanese blood in their veins, as the proponents of the internment said, blood will tell. It's the idea that you just can't be an American. Next slide, please. The sentiments, by the way, predated Pearl Harbor. So when people say, oh, well, it was because of Pearl Harbor, that's just not true. There are leading politicians all throughout the Jim Crow era, especially in California, who ran on platforms of keep the Asians out. The 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act became the 1917 Asiatic Barred Zone. And politicians of both political parties sought to outdo themselves in the desire to remove everyone of Asian descent. Even Dr. Seuss, before he became Dr. Seuss, before Cat in the Hat, Green Eggs and Ham, and so on, he was Theodore Geisel. He drew propaganda cartoons depicting Japanese Americans as likely to commit acts of treason on behalf of the Japanese Empire. This is manifested again now in the China Initiative, in which researchers and scientists of Chinese descent, including native-born Americans, are suspected of committing all sorts of acts at the behest of the Chinese government, and they're being prosecuted, and some would argue, and I would agree, persecuted. Now, some of them have done something wrong, but it's typically not espionage. It's the sort of thing that if they were of different backgrounds, they would have received a slap on the wrist. Someone would have come to them and said, hey, you know, you didn't quite fill out these forms as you should have. Let's have you redo them. But instead, they're being sent to prison and having their lives ruined. Next slide, please. This culminates in the Vincent Chin case. I'm going to just speak briefly about this case. Many of you know of it because you've come to a CHSA event, but for most Americans, Vincent Chin is not a name they know, even if they know the other names of the iconic martyrs of the civil rights movement. Chin was a guy, an ordinary guy. He didn't set out to be an iconic martyr. Briefly, in 1982 in Detroit, I need to pause on both those. 1982, the U.S. is emerging from a recession with double-digit inflation, double-digit unemployment. It's called stagflation for stagnation and inflation. Some of you lived through it. Remember, gasoline had to be rationed. You could only buy it certain days, depending on whether your license plate ended in odd or even digit. And America was suffering, but Japan was triumphant. Suddenly, everyone was driving imported cars, right? Those Hondas, Datsuns, and Subarus, cars with funny names. Some of you will be old enough to remember, it used to be your dad or your granddad was loyal to Ford or Chevy, and every 2 or 3 years would trade in that car for another. Everyone drove the mighty American V8. Well, rich people might have had a Mercedes, hippies had Volkswagens, but pretty much nobody drove Japanese cars. That is until the oil crisis, when OPEC called an embargo. And suddenly those 4-cylinder engines, those little cars, those economic cars, the high quality construction, they became appealing. People called it a second Pearl Harbor, an economic Pearl Harbor, rise of the East, decline of the West. And Detroit, where I grew up, is the motor city for a reason. Everyone there makes cars. That's why my family was there. My father worked for one of the big 4 U.S. automakers. All right, back to Chin. So Chin is Chinese American. Chinese American. He's 27 years old. He had actually been adopted. His father, Chinese American, had fought for the United States during World War II. His mother had come from China. They weren't able to have children, so they adopted him from an orphanage in Hong Kong. He grew up as a working class kind of guy. He was definitely not the model minority. He dropped out of college. He was back in trade school. He was learning to be a draftsman, working as a waiter. And he just was a guy, you know? He made friends easily. He was assimilated. He was very Americanized. And so with some buddies of his, he went out one night for a bachelor's party. You see, he'd met a nice young lady, Vicky, and they were due to be married. Like him, she was Chinese American from that working class, Cantonese speaking, restaurant owning part of the Chinese American population, and salt of the earth, really. You know, good folks who were hardworking, didn't get into trouble. So Chin goes out with these friends of his, and he's no saint. And I think that makes the story more, not less compelling. He's just a guy. So he wants to have a bachelor's party just like any other American guy. So they go to a seedy part of town, to a strip club, and there they encounter 2 other gentlemen who are white. They're auto workers. They look over at Chin, and according to witnesses, they start to use those racial slurs that I remember so well from the common cruelty of childhood bullying. You know those words that were shouted at you on the playground, words like chink and jap, and a word that they don't even use anymore, nip. And Chin said, you know, I'm not Japanese. Remember, he's Chinese American. But as we were all told again and again, you all look alike. Well, one of the men finally shouted, according to witnesses, not Chin's friends, that shouted at him, "You little motherfucker." I have to pardon the language, but that's what the witness said. They said, "You little motherfuckers are why we're out of work." Meaning, never mind that he was Chinese American and working class just like them, feeling the pinch of economic anxiety. To his attackers, he represented Toyota and Tokyo. Using a baseball bat they had in the trunk of their car after the sun had set on a fine summer's night, off of Woodward Avenue, the major thoroughfare of the Motor City. They bludgeoned Chin to death, cracking his head open. And with blood and spinal fluid and cerebral matter coming out of his skull, pulling out of the pavement beneath him, he uttered the last words, "It's not fair." He lapsed into a coma as the EMT on the scene said, nobody survives a head wound like that. So a few days later, having never regained consciousness, he died. The guests who would have attended his wedding went to his funeral instead. This was mistaken identity twice over: Chinese for Japanese, American for foreign. It wouldn't have been right if his attackers had found a Japanese foreign national and killed that person. But nobody stops and pauses and says, "Oh, hey, may I check your passport?" before they assault you in such a brutal manner. Now, the two men, it's important to note, never for a moment denied they did it. They always admitted it. They took a plea deal. They couldn't very well say they hadn't. There were dozens of witnesses. The brutal attack had to be stopped by an off-duty cop who drew a service revolver. Witnesses said the older of the two men was trying to hit a home run. He was swinging that bat so hard. But they said it was just a bar brawl. They were even aggrieved that people thought they were bigots. They insisted, no, despite the racial slurs, despite what they had said, their lawyers on appeal actually even argued that Orientals aren't protected by civil rights laws. Well, the two men were sentenced to probation for 3 years and a fine of $3,000 each. There's much more to the story. Suffice it to say that this is an example of what happens when people think you're not an American. Even though, as the defense lawyers pointed out, Chin and his attackers were really sort of the same, except for the color of skin, the texture of hair, and the shape of eyes. Next slide, please. Asian Americans have long served in the U.S. military as well. There's Senator Daniel Inouye with his empty right sleeve because he lost that limb charging a Nazi bunker, chatting with John F. Kennedy. Tammy Duckworth, who is currently serving in the Senate, who lost both her legs in service. When she first ran for her current office, in a debate, she talked about how her family had served in the United States in its armed forces for 13 generations of unbroken loyalty and risking their lives and limbs. To which her opponent promptly mocked her and said, "Oh, I didn't know there were Asians with George Washington." Well, Tammy Duckworth, you may know, is Anglo-Asian. The Duckworth family has served for 13 generations. On her father's side, she could join the Daughters of the American Revolution. On her mother's side, she's Thai Chinese, part of the Chinese diaspora that has settled throughout Asia. We also see Filipino soldiers there who fought so bravely for the United States against Japanese forces, promised citizenship for themselves and their families. They had to continue the fight after the war for that promise to be made good to them. There were women who served, Chinese American women, for example, who were Army aviators. Aviatrix was the gender term that was used then during World War II. And you may know that Chinese American veterans, like the Japanese Americans and Filipino Americans before them, were recently awarded a Congressional Gold Medal. There are actually a few, couple hundred. They're trying to identify all of them. These are men, they're all in their late 90s by now, but in the touching ceremonies to confer these medals. This is just to show that Asian Americans have been part of America in every sense for far longer than people imagine. Next slide, please. I wanted to just acknowledge the diversity within diversity. This talk is primarily about Chinese Americans, but among Asian Americans, there are South Asians, there are Pacific Islanders to whom we give short shrift, there are Southeast Asian refugees. And as far as Chinese Americans go, many of these individuals are also Chinese Americans. What I mean by that is many Filipinos, for example, are of Chinese descent. Many Southeast Asians are also of Chinese descent or of mixed background. The Chinese who've migrated to the United States have come from all sorts of places, including Malaysia, Indonesia, and elsewhere as part of a diaspora that's migrated more than once in the history of the family. And among Chinese Americans, there are those who claim roots on the mainland, in Taiwan, in Hong Kong. There are those who are Mandarin speaking, Cantonese speaking, and every type of dialect you can imagine, Shanghai speaking. So there's tremendous diversity within. And I always like to acknowledge diversity within diversity. Next slide, please. There also is just a tremendous amount of diversity that we hardly ever think about. I show you two images here. They both, the main images are actually of people of Chinese descent. So the photo on the right is a young woman being lifted in a bat mitzvah, the traditional Jewish coming of age ceremony adopted from a Chinese orphanage by a Jewish family. She's Chinese and Jewish. The person on the left is my favorite jazz artist, Charles Mingus, Afro-Asian, or in the vernacular, Blasian. This is his second album, released in the late 50s. You might think to yourself, what is he, making fun of Chinese people? No, it's the opposite. He's paying homage to his grandfather. His grandfather was 100% Chinese, making Charles Mingus 1/4 Chinese, and his album is named Mingus Dynasty, and he put on those robes because he wanted to acknowledge and say to the world, yeah, I'm Blasian. Keanu Reeves is part Hawaiian Chinese, as you may know, so that in his cameo in Always Be My Maybe, all of the leading men were Asian. Keanu Reeves has since acknowledged his Asian ancestry. People have tried to calculate exactly how much it is. It's definitely there. His estranged father, Samuel Lowe, was from a Hawaiian Chinese and Anglo family. Tiger Woods, of course, is famously Cablinasian, and his mother is Thai, with some Chinese heritage as well. Next slide, please. There are now efforts by some of these families to trace their Asian roots. So you may know Paula Madison's documentary and book, Finding Samuel Lowe. She and her brothers, 3 Black siblings from Harlem, decided they wanted to figure out what happened to their Chinese grandfather. So there's a whole story of Afro-Asians that I don't think anyone really has written the book about, and we hardly ever speak about it. There are Punjabi Mexicans, there are just so many different combinations, and I hope that some of you joining us are part of such communities and will share your stories. Next slide, please. We come now to the pandemic, and at this point, we've all seen the headlines, we've watched the videos, case after case after case, people of Asian descent, whether they're from China or elsewhere, and even if they're Americans through and through, are being blamed. It isn't just the fear of catching a disease, it's culpability for the pandemic. So even as we emerge from our apartments and houses, as we resume normal life with or without masks, the Asian elderly are cloistered and stay in their homes for fear that if they venture out, they will be spit upon, shoved to the ground so hard that their bones are broken, stabbed, even shot. Case after case after case. Initially, people said, well, how do you know it's race? Well, there's so many of these that it's become a pattern. As a lawyer, I can say, I don't know if the perpetrator in this case or that case, if the evidence will bear out that it was a hate crime, but whether it was racist in intent, it's racial in effect. It is traumatizing a specific community and terrorizing them. Next slide, please. The photo at the top is of a man whose face has been slashed. He's now permanently disfigured. He said plaintively, nobody came, nobody helped. Of course, in Atlanta, 6 of the 8 victims were Asian women, and that after the killer had confessed, so there was no doubt that he was the perpetrator, the law enforcement officer investigating the case said, well, he was having a bad day. as if not only to deny that it was a hate crime, but dismiss that it was a crime at all. When I saw that, I thought, well, that's got to be fake news, but it turned out to be real. And then that law enforcement officer was discovered, to nobody's surprise, to be himself spreading the China virus meme on social media, which is creating the toxic environment within which all this happens. In the middle is the video of the case from New York City. If you haven't seen it, I cannot commend it to you because it's brutal and it's real. But it's a Filipino woman on her way to church, older. So many of these victims are older women, knocked to the ground, kicked in the head repeatedly until she's in critical condition. Now, the perpetrator was disturbed, apparently a recently released felon. But what's shocking is not only his attack, but what happens in the last 3 seconds of the video, where it becomes apparent that 2 gentlemen, who presumably are not disturbed and convicted felons, 2 gentlemen have been watching the entire time, and rather than help, they go and they literally close the door on the scene and walk away. Next slide, please. Gender, of course, is a part of this. There was a pointless debate. Well, was Atlanta about race or about gender, when it could be, of course, about both, with the hypersexualization of Asian women and all of these images, the yellow fever fetish of trying to find an Asian mail order bride. Next slide, please. I'll end on a positive note, though. A few weekends ago, I was humbled to attend a rally in Flushing, Queens. For those of you who don't know, Flushing has become a new Chinatown, actually much more than a new Chinatown. There are Asian immigrants from everywhere, and Queens is a borough, the New York way of referring to a county, is the most diverse place on the face of the planet now in terms of language. On the campus of Queens College, our students, they come from homes where 83 different languages are in use. Well, at this rally in downtown Flushing, I was honored to have the chance to say a few words. And when I went up to the podium, I looked out at the crowd and I said, I've never seen this. I've never seen so many Asian Americans rallying, standing up and speaking out, and what a sight it is to see. Many of them were giving out or had received yellow whistles. That's a project to distribute free whistles to people that they can blow on to call for help. Or if you're a bystander, you can be an upstander by blowing on the whistle if you see one of these crimes. It's yellow because that, of course, is a color that's been used historically in a derogatory way to refer to people of East Asian descent. And it's imprinted with the message, "We belong." There was something else, though, significant about that moment. The speakers who proceeded to the podium before and after me included Senator Chuck Schumer, Mayor Bill de Blasio, State Attorney General Letitia James, civil rights activist Al Sharpton, the borough president Donovan Richards, who's African-American, who co-hosted the event with Congresswoman Grace Meng, who's Chinese-American. It included people who were white, people who were black, people who were Latino, people who were Jewish, alongside people who were Asian American, including, of course, Chinese American. I've never seen that either. The hate crimes legislation that passed, President Biden's speeches, everything that's happened alongside the tragic, terrible attacks, I'd like to think confirms that American ideals remain strong. That what beckoned the world over to our grandparents, our parents, and to us, those ideals that appealed, that enabled people to take risks, to make a voyage, to undergo sacrifices that they know the next generation would not appreciate nearly enough, that they are compelling still. America has always had and still has the greatest of principles. We must now put them into practice. Thank you so much. Why don't we end the slideshow and we can start with questions. And again, I want to thank CHSA and every one of you in the audience. It's truly a pleasure to be here with you and just great to be part of this program.
Thank you so much.
Do I see there are 50 questions and comments already? That's great.
Yeah, so people have been sending questions to Jeffrey, who was running our Q&A, and I've been writing notes throughout it just to kind of organize everything. So I'm going to just start you off with one question that I have, and then I'm also going to be going through the questions to kind of have an organized flow to everything. But please continue to send questions either to Jeffrey or in the regular chat. But my question, Frank, that one of the reasons I had wanted you to come speak with CHSA, because we had started talking, I think like October and November, was kind of about your journey and, you know, being at Queens College. And if you could kind of talk a little bit about how your experiences and what you've learned along the way have shaped your journey, and specifically how it's got you to Queens College. So kind of maybe a softball question, but.
Sure. You know, and thank you. I actually want to offer something that I think is of general use and maybe gently provocative. So let me first answer the question directly. So I was appointed at Queens College, part of the City University of New York, as president. I'm one of two Asian American presidents who started at the same time. My friend David Wu was appointed at our sister institution, Baruch College. He was named actually just a few weeks before me, and he became then the first Asian American to be named president of what is the largest urban university system in the world. We have a total of, I think, about 280,000 students in a system that has 25 campuses total when you count all the two-year schools, the four-year schools, and the professional schools. My school, Queens College, is 20,000 students. So what we're most like is the Cal State system. So imagine that it's like my old friend Les Wong, who used to be president of San Francisco State. That's what Queens College is like. It's a diverse, wonderful place. I didn't set out to be just a college president. I wanted to be the Queens College president because of the diversity and because we still believe in American higher education as the engine of the American dream. That's how I got here. My parents came as scholarship students in the early 1960s. So I'm coming full circle. But, you know, when David was named, I said to my wife, well, that's it. They're never going to pick me because they picked an Asian American. Plus, his name is Wu. They're not going to pick two Wus, but they did. And it's a testament to the belief of the Board of Trustees in diversity and how it's a strength. And I'd like to think both he and I, though we're different, are each in our own way qualified for the roles that we have. But when you look, there are hardly any Asian American presidents, chancellors, et cetera. At every institution of higher education where I had a leadership role, I was the first Asian American ever. And that's remarkable. I say that not to say I'm special, but the opposite, to say, you know, why weren't there Asian Americans before? Well, you know, there are many reasons for that. There's explicit bias. When I interviewed as a law professor at a California school, no less, this is in 1994, the senior most member of the faculty said, oh, how appropriate, we have the Asian candidate today. Now, I remember I was just sort of puzzled, you know, what's so special about today? And I realized it was December 7th. That's Pearl Harbor Day. So, you know, that was his wisecrack. That was his joke before my interview that, you know, that's what he thought of. Now, that's not the worst thing ever, but it is one of those forms of microaggression, you know, that suggests you don't really belong here, that the only thing that people remember is something about your race. Plus, he was thinking about the Japanese attack on the US. So wrong lineage, and also I'm an American and native born, right? But there's something that I want to say. I said I'd be gently provocative. There is something that Asian Americans, some of us, do, and I don't want to stereotype myself, but I will say there is an attitude that is common to many East Asian cultures. There's a Japanese proverb that's the best known version. The nail that sticks up is pounded down. What is that about? That's about being quiet. It's about knowing your place. It's about deferring to your elders. It's about fidelity to tradition. It's about not making a fuss, right? It values above all conformity. There's a Chinese adage, the loudest duck is shot first by the hunter, right? Same sentiment. There's a phrase in Mandarin, 不要找麻烦, which if you know Mandarin is, it literally translates as, you know, don't go looking for complications, but it's also don't get involved, right? So when I was in high school, this is a long time ago, when I was in high school, I was elected to student government. My parents said to me, "You must quit. You have to study. That's how you're going to get into a good college." Well, little did they know serving in student government would have helped me get into a good college, right? All right. What's my point here? My point is there is something that we were taught by our parents or grandparents, many of us, not all of us, but many of us, and it was to not make eye contact, to be quiet, to study hard, to work hard. If you face discrimination or exploitation, just work harder and people will realize how good you are. Well, compare that to the American adage, the squeaky wheel gets the grease. If you're being discriminated against or exploited and all you do is work harder, you're kind of showing you'll put up with discrimination and you're willing to be exploited, right? So I respect my parents. I wouldn't be where I am if it weren't for the high standards they set. But I wonder if a strategy that we've internalized that worked for a different generation, a different era, in a different place. So, if you're apologetic, if you're deferential, well, that's not interpreted the way it would be in Asia as polite and appropriate behavior. It's interpreted as weakness when you're practicing law in San Francisco at a major firm, right? It's yet, I also know that when Asian Americans then try to be one of the guys or gals, then they're just trying too hard, right? Your social superiors are always judging you. So this is a quandary. I raise it as a question, not an answer, to say, I wonder if maybe some of the things that we've tried to do might not be the best way to advance the interests that we have for us to achieve our aspirations. So I think you have many, many questions. I'm happy to take a few. We've already, we're past the 1 hour mark, but I think you have this scheduled for about 90 minutes or so. So I'm happy to continue chatting, and great to see so many participants, including old friends and new friends. So thank you so much for being here, everyone.
Yeah, thank you, Frank. So we do have lots of questions. And so I'm going to start with one question. My first question, and I'm sorry, I think it comes from Kathleen. Did you follow the Asian American Foundation fundraiser last night? I'm not sure if you.
Yeah, I wasn't able to make the fundraiser, but what's the question?
She had a question, and I'm kind of paraphrasing it. There's a lot of, so I'm going to paraphrase it. The gist of the question is that, do you think the resentment of the model minority myth is leading to the violence that Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders are experiencing today? That's the first part. And the second part, do you have any suggestions for building allyship? And it's related to a suggestion that Daniel Day Kim made during the fundraiser last night. I was trying to do some research in the background and I couldn't find his exact statement. So
that's okay. So yeah, I'll answer both those questions. Yeah, I think it absolutely does, because when for ideological reasons, people who aren't Asian American hold up Asian Americans and go to Black people and say, "We like the Asians. Just follow their example." That does not make people like you. It makes people resent you deeply, right? And we can object because comparing racial groups is fraught, right? Probably a bad idea. But if you're going to compare, it's a totally unfair comparison, right? It's a comparison of immigrants versus those whose ancestors were brought in bondage. It's a comparison of people who may have actual wealth from the get-go or human capital with those who don't. It's a comparison of those who have a stereotype that's advantageous as compared to a stereotype that's highly disadvantageous, right? So even if you were going to compare, if you put aside your qualms about comparing, you would say, this is, that's not really a very good comparison, right? And I'll share a couple of more personal thoughts about this. I spent a decade teaching at Howard University, the nation's leading historically Black institution of higher education. And I learned as much as I taught. I realized I have prejudice. We all do, right? Despite myself. It's just the images rattling around in the back of your head. And I enjoy privilege just walking down the street. Now, no one wants to engage in a contest of suffering. I don't propose to do that. There are no winners. And we've all seen this violence recently. In general, though, when I walk down the street, people leave me alone. Yeah, sometimes kids come up and want to challenge me to a kung fu karate match, right? Sometimes a car drives by, someone rolls down their window and they shout, "Go back to where you came from." Every now and then someone says chink or jab or goop or something like that. That does happen, right? And it can escalate. That's what we see in all this violence. But, if you're African American and you're out for a jog, you might get hunted down and shot and killed by people who then make a video, as in the Ahmaud Arbery case. You might be bird watching in Central Park in New York City. And, if you're going to generalize, I'm going to bet bird watchers are a pretty peaceful bunch of people, right? But someone will call 911 and say you're a thug, right? So there's an image of Black criminality that just haunts as a specter someone who's African American who's walking down the street, whether they're an honors student or whoever they are, right? And I'll be honest, I really struggle with something, and I want to be sympathetic and I want to explain. And so perhaps those who are part of this can help me. Even now, people contact me from time to time. They know that I do talks and I'm an activist and advocate. And they contact me and they say, "When are you going to stand up for Asian people against Black people?" Which I think, oh, geez, this is probably not the way to go about it, right? I am going to stand up for Asian people. And I'm not going to hesitate to point out, and I have done this in print. If you Google it, you can find, I wrote a piece for Huffington Post called "Help Us, Asians Under Attack," or something like that. I wrote that 5 or 6 years ago. Reverend Al Sharpton, who is African American, was at that rally, and he said he would be a hypocrite if he didn't come. And he called out the African American perpetrators, but he didn't suggest it was Black people. It was Black persons, it was individuals, right? Kareem Abdul-Jabbar I just saw him on TV. There's a new NBA Social Justice Award. He was wearing a t-shirt that said, "Make a friend who doesn't look like you." And on it was Kareem and the late Bruce Lee. And Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, who is African-American, called out African-American perpetrators. So Reverend Al Sharpton and basketball great Kareem Abdul-Jabbar were able to do that in a way that I would like humbly to try to channel and copy. What they were doing is saying, look, the people who commit these acts of violence, that is bad. It needs to be condemned. It needs to be fought. It needs to be responded to. That doesn't mean that every Black person is to blame, right? In the Atlanta case, it was a white perpetrator. We don't then think all white people are going to take semi-automatic weapons, drive around and shoot Asian people. We understand that was a disturbed person. And the act was racial. It was wrong, deeply, deeply, deeply wrong, morally wrong, not just legally wrong. And it demands a response, and it's devastating. But we don't attribute the act of that individual to a whole group. Yet with African Americans, with Hispanics as well, but with African Americans especially, there's this tendency, and people have actually studied this. People have studied crimes where it's the same thing. It's wrong. It's a crime, right? And they've looked at, for example, the imposition of the death penalty. They've looked at all sorts of ways, and what they've shown is African Americans are punished to a greater degree. And so even if we left aside everything about principle and ideals, what I would say as gently as I can, and it's never victims, I would never criticize a victim of a crime. It's demagogues. What I would try to say to them is, look, what do you think it would happen if I, Wu, stood up and said, I condemn Black people? That's not going to lead to something good. That's going to lead to something very, very bad, right? And we need allies. That's what we've seen. Black Lives Matter has been around for a long time, but after the killing of Mr. George Floyd, so many joined. There were Asian American youth who a few years ago, before the killing of Mr. George Floyd, wrote a letter to their parents. And there was that student at Yale who wrote a letter, and it immediately attracted a rebuke from her elders who said, "Oh, you're just one of these Americanized, leftists. Um, but I still have hope for allyship, for bridge building. And I understand if you just landed in a spaceship from Mars, or if you came from China and you just looked around and you had no background, you would have some really, just from mass media, right? Just from the headlines, just from the movies, you would have been exposed to this before you got here. You would have some images that are pretty hard to shake that suggest that when something goes wrong, when there's violent crime, look for the black person, right? And blame that person. But I still have hope that we can come together. You know, my father, he's in his mid 80s. So, and here, I won't generalize, but I will say, and maybe some of you had similar experiences. My parents were happily married for more than 50 years until my mother passed away. Never once did they express affection for one another. Never once did they express affection for their children, right? I was raised by Asian immigrants who, to the best of my awareness, seemed to have no affection for anyone and not to believe in having fun, right? Now, that's not actually true. That's just the image, because the cultural background they came from was just not demonstrative the way modern American culture is. And so my father and I, like many Asian immigrant fathers and their American-born sons, we don't talk about that much. But I went to visit him not too long ago to check up on him because of all this violence. And, you know, like the rest of the nation, he'd been transfixed by the murder trial for the killing of Mr. George Floyd. My father made it a point to tell me something. So, you know, we don't talk about that much, but he wanted to say to me, that was wrong. He said, that was ridiculous what those police officers did to that man. I thought to myself, yeah, because it's so egregious. It's so in your face. So if we as Asian Americans want sympathy, if we want allies, you know, if you want a friend, you have to be a friend, right? And so without for a moment minimizing that there are, yes, Black and brown people who are attacking Asians, it's important to understand that those are Black and brown persons. They're people who happen to be Black and brown. It's not because of their skin color that they're perpetrating the attacks. And that what we need to do is find as many allies as we can to address these issues, not to go around preemptively making enemies of people who could be helpful to us. So what are the strategies? The strategy is to appeal to American ideals. The last thing I'll say, and you know, I hope I've said something you disagree with, and I'll explain why. That's part of the nail that sticks up is pounded down versus squeaky wheel gets the grease. It's okay to disagree with me, right? That's fine. You don't, some of the things I've said here are statements of fact, right? Like about the railroad workers. They really did build the western half of the railroad, 10 to 15,000 of them. They really were excluded. Other statements are statements of opinion that you probably agree with. For example, it's wrong to exclude them from the festivity for the railroad when they built the western half. That's not right. Other things like strategies, of course you can disagree. And if you have a better strategy, I'm actually interested in knowing what strategies will work because it's probably more than one. But I'm going to suggest there's one that won't work. So there's something on social media. I don't know how many of you are active on WeChat, Chinese social media. My own opinion is all social media is scary. It doesn't matter who participates or what language. Social media intrinsically just amps up and appeals to the worst sides of us, you know, myself included. You just read Yelp reviews and the negative ones. You think, wow, you know, because the waiter was 2 minutes late bringing you a glass of water, you wrote, you know, page after page of how you wanted to give this restaurant a 0 if you could. Well, on Chinese language social media, there's quite a bit of discussion of all this stuff. And one of the themes that you'll run into is, yeah, people had better bow down before us because China is going to rule the world, and therefore you shouldn't take advantage of Chinese people. allow me humbly to suggest that's not an effective strategy. Appealing to American principles and saying we want what Americans want is going to work. Saying we're Chinese and we're going to take over the world is going to play into the yellow peril stereotype and just confirm everyone's worst fears. So I do not go around saying I'm Chinese and I'm superior to you, therefore bow down to me. I go around saying, look, I'm an American. I'm just like you. I want what you want. And I found that to be a more successful strategy. But if others have different ideas about strategies, I would love to hear them.
Okay, thank you. I see there's, yes, lots of comments about like kind of this discussion. So maybe we'll send that chat log later to kind of filter through everything, because there is, I think there's a little bit of a disagreement. But I think you raised an important point, is that it's important to have these discussions. It's important to kind of talk, and that's, as an educational institution, we want to have these discussions.
Yeah.
And people get to a point where they can learn, and we can build an understanding, and we know more about how we can be good allies,
Yeah.
and also grow as a community.
Yeah, and you know, one of the things that I absolutely agree with is that anti-Asian sentiment spills right over into anti-Asian American sentiment, because most people can't tell the difference. You've probably seen the results of the survey. Most Americans can't name a single prominent Asian American, right? They just can't. And pressed to name an Asian American, most will name someone who's Asian, right? They can't name an Asian American, even though they're Asian American astronauts, professional athletes. There's an Asian American vice president, right, of the United States. There are Asian American actors. There are lots of Asian Americans. There are Asian American social media celebrities, but most people just can't name someone who's Asian American.
Yeah, we actually we do a community roundtable. We used to do that like once a month. And that's something that we were talking about, like, who are our Asian American heroes? And I think there was a lot of like, oh, we need to think about this. And that was kind of something I think was a down moment for all of us, is that we want to be. And so we've been, that's where we're kind of be active in these programs and focusing more, we need to focus on the collective history, but also trying to feature individuals as well to share more here is who has changed our history and people who are actively involved. So yes, thank you, Frank, for pointing that out, and yeah, for shedding light on something that we need to be more aware of. My next question, I think this will probably be our last one.
Sure.
Kind of like, what are your thoughts about the term BIPOC, and how that kind of builds, or talks about more civil rights or that collective group? I don't know if that, yeah.
Yeah, there are lots of terms that come and go. BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, People of Color, is one that has come into vogue. And, language changes. We were all Orientals before, and that term has fallen out of favor. And it's sort of hard to explain to folks why Oriental is a problem, right? I think it is a problem, just like Chinaman is a problem. But people will say, well, why is it a problem? There are people who are Asian who use the word Oriental themselves. Yes, that's true. And people say, well, you can say Irishman, but you can't say Chinaman. Well, why is that? Well, some of this is context and history, right? Because when you look at how Oriental was used, it has these connotations of exoticism, right? Of not belonging. And that's why it was replaced by Asian American. Asian American is an artificial identity in the best sense, right? When my parents got here, they weren't Asian American. There aren't very many Asians in Asia. There's no sense of Pan-Asian identity. Japan's East Asian co-prosperity sphere was a euphemism for Japanese imperial aggression and annexation. If you accost someone in Shanghai, Seoul, or Saigon, you say, what are you? They're not going to say they're Asian. They're Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Vietnamese, Cambodian, Laotian, Filipino, Hmong, they're Indian, they're Pakistani. They're not Asian, just as there aren't that many Europeans in Europe or Africans in Africa. But over time, Asian American took hold. It was coined by Emma G. and Yuji Ichioka, two student activists, in 1968, right, as part of the Third World Strike and movement. For those who don't know, and CHSA is born of these same sentiments, There was a yellow power movement in the San Francisco Bay Area, modeled on the Black Power movement, right? Sounds quaint. So BIPOC is the latest in a series of terms. People wonder, well, does it include or does it not include people who are Asian American? Does it give priority? I'm not that hung up on the specific term. What I'm interested in is, how is it used? What happens? What are the practical effects? And I'm all for the strategies that produce better outcomes, more diversity, equity, and inclusion. And whatever terms produce more diversity, equity, and inclusion, that's better, right? So again, thank you so very much. I hope I've given you something to think about and open up the opportunity for conversation over the dinner table with you and your loved ones. It's always a pleasure to work with CHSA and terrific to have been part of this conversation. I want to thank everyone at CHSA, and as soon as it's possible for us to gather in person safely, I hope we will do that. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Frank. You brought up, there's so many different, issues and bigger issues that you're trying to compact or, present to people. So I really appreciate, sharing your thoughts and being a part of this discussion. And I do hope that, I'm not sure if you plan on being in San Francisco soon, but we hopefully will be kind of having a light reopening sometime soon. The Bruce Lee exhibit is coming in fall, winter, so that's kind of delaying our ability to reopen fully. But we hope that there's a lot of people who've been talking about the history of Chinese Americans and us discussing that, and we're hoping to have it in our exhibit in a digital format so people can engage with that history. But we also really appreciate what you have discussed today and that we can share that with our audiences, because this is important that we are having these discussions. And thank you for being someone who is willing to discuss this and have people disagree with them, because that's very important.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank
All
you.
right.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye, friends.
Yeah, have a good afternoon, everyone.